Morning, colleagues, and welcome to this 25th meeting in 2018 of the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee. Graham Simpson, the convener of the committee, is attending to other parliamentary business this morning and therefore is unable to be with us, and he sends his apologies. Bill Bowman MSP will be joining us when his committee that he is currently in finishes very soon. He'll be substituting for Graham. So before we move to the main item of business, there is one piece of business that the committee must decide first, and that's on agenda item number 1. It's proposed that the committee takes item number 3 in private. This item is the consideration of the evidence that we are about to hear on the UK Trade Bill. Does the committee agree to take the item 3 in private? Okay, thank you. Okay, today we are scrutinising the Legislative Consent Memorandum for the UK Trade Bill, and we have before us today George Hollingbury MP, the Minister of State for Trade Policy of the UK Government. Mr Hollingbury is accompanied by Suzanne Greaves OBE, Trade Bill Manager, Department for International Trade, Eleanor Beavis, Head of Domestic Portfolio, the Trade Strategy, Department for International Trade, and Rebecca Hackett, the Deputy Director of Policy of the Scotland Office. I'll let you take your seat. May I welcome you all to this meeting, and thank you for taking the time to come to the Scottish Parliament. I know you've already had a busy morning giving evidence to the Finance and Constitution Committee, so I certainly welcome you to this committee as well. As you know, one of the committee's roles is to look at all legislative consent memorandums which contain delegated powers and report to the relevant lead committee. Our questions today are therefore focused on the delegated powers in the Trade Bill. I do highlight, though, that we may stray into some policy areas from time to time, but that is not the purpose of this committee, and I will allow some latitude for some questioning, but if we do stray too far into policy, then I will ask my colleagues to stop that. But I'd like to invite the Minister to make an opening statement, and after that I'll open up to questions from members. Minister.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Convener, and thanks for having all of us in today. I have to say, this is possibly the most titanic table I've ever sat at. It's pretty extraordinary. And whilst I was dreading would be the wrong word, but was somewhat tense about my appearance in the last committee, this one scares me rigid. This is a very technical area. Anyway, thank you for inviting me to address your committee today, which I understand looks, as you've already outlined, aspects of the Trade Bill, and will feed back into the Finance and Constitution Committee your opinions, and of course from where I have just arrived. As I explained to that committee, the UK Government wants all parts of the UK to support this bill, and we will continue our comprehensive engagement with the Scottish Government to ensure we secure its recommendation for a legislative consent motion. With this in mind, I note the Scottish Government's memorandum on the LCM from December 2017, and of course since then the UK Government has taken significant strides through its amendments, making improvements to the bill and answering many of the concerns that were expressed in the memorandum. Beyond this, I'm conscious that members here today have specific and technical questions, particularly on clauses 1 and 2, and I look forward, along with colleagues, to providing responses as an important step to help deliver this bill for the whole of the UK. I would just finally reflect, Convener, as I just mentioned to you in our private conversation, that this is a technical area. There will be times, undoubtedly, when officials are better placed than I am to give you full answers, and I hope members of the committee will allow me to do so, and I think they will actually simply get better answers.
Thank you very much for your opening comments, Minister. And yeah, certainly we've got no issue at all with your colleagues in that particular area. So I'll open up for question 1. It certainly appears that the general intention behind the powers in clause 1 to implement the government's procurement agreement is that the UK would continue to be an independent member of the agreement. The delegated powers continue to be an independent. The delegated powers memorandum for the bill explains that the power is required to reflect any changes needed as a result of the process whereby the UK becomes an independent member. Can you explain the scope of the powers that would be available to the Scottish ministers to make potential amendments to the terms of the government procurement agreement? And could the powers actually be used to implement further substantive changes to the GPA, given that procurement is a devolved matter?
I'm going to go slide across the top of this for a moment and then ask Ellen to fill in underneath. Simply, the point of having the powers as they are set in the bill is to allow rapid response to any changes in the schedules that adhere to the GPA. In principle, the power is there simply to slide across what we have already agreed into UK schedules with a minimum of fuss, such that the delegated powers are there to just take any bits that need changing in three particular areas, and particularly accession to and withdrawal from the GPA, such that it reflects the current reality on the ground. Is it possible that these powers could be made used more widely? Yes, it is. But it is absolutely our intention, and I can say that publicly here today and put on the record, that the government is not going to use the powers for that purpose. It is our intention to move this agreement across such that it can be used in its current form in the UK on a legal basis. Anna, do you have anything to add?
Yes, I'll run through the scope of the Clause 1 powers now, if that's helpful. So it allows for changes of our domestic regulation to reflect the UK's independent accession to the GPA as we leave the EU. As the Minister referenced, there will be no substantive changes as we accede to the GPA on the same terms and with the same coverage as we have now. The power also allows us to update our measures as new countries indeed accede or withdraw from the agreement. And it allows us to update Annex 1 of the GPA, which is the list that covers what entities are covered by that agreement. So, for example, when that agreement was made, the Department for International Trade didn't exist, so we will need to do some technical updates to make sure that list of entities is factually accurate.
Just on that, also in the previous committee, there was quite a wide discussion around clauses 1 and 2. And so one aspect that was raised earlier, which certainly has an impact in this particular line of questioning too, is the aspect of the Scottish ministers having any type of input to engage with that particular area, and there seemed to be some some debate in that area of discussion. I think your officials this morning, Minister, mentioned that there have been regular and wide discussions at official level, but not at ministerial level. And so will Scottish ministers and with this Parliament actually have an opportunity to help shape this particular area of discussion?
Are we talking specifically about GPA?
Yes.
In that, and again, I invite officials to jump in and save me at any stage. We are transitioning across the agreement which we currently carry, on which basis any changes that are being made are simply to make the powers that currently exist through the EU available to British institutions through the UK, on which basis any decisions that Scottish ministers have already taken in using that power are already made and are already there, and the powers that they had before will still be there. I think that is correct. In which case, I think my steer has been from the beginning that the Scottish Government was content with us re-acceding or transitioning across the GPA agreement, in which case I wouldn't anticipate that there was any need for ministerial level contact on this, in that we are simply enabling Scottish ministers to continue taking the powers that they have previously had. I believe that to be the case.
Okay. Neil?
In your officials jumping in to save you, maybe we could get some officials to jump in and save the Prime Minister, but maybe I think that might be a stretch too far. Let's not go there, please. In terms of the way in which the government has handled the whole issue around devolved powers, I think many of us would believe, and across parties, that it's been a pretty disastrous approach, and we're now heading for the Supreme Court. Consent is vital going forward, so that we provide some certainty for businesses and for workers and jobs, that people who are feeling very, their position is very precarious. So as we go forward and regulations and devolved powers come forward, how is that mechanism going to, what mechanism is going to be there, A, for consultation and B, for disputes?
And in which particular areas are we focusing on?
Well, all of them. I mean, if we're talking about developing frameworks, if we're talking about new regulations coming forward, if these are coming forward, what discussions with the devolved administrations, how are they going to take place? And secondly, if there's differences of opinion, how are those disputes going to be resolved?
Okay, so I'm going to narrow my comments down to just the bill, which is what I'm here to talk about. But I take your point, Kavina, that wider questions come up, and I'll refer, if I may, to Rebecca.
Things will relate to trade.
Of course they will. I understand that. We are continuing to work on how we discuss trade issues. It's a reserved matter, as we know, to the UK. Officials meeting officials on a regular basis to talk about the existing Memorandum of Understanding, concordats, and so on and so forth, and to see where we are in the process of development of those. And in fact, Rebecca just spoke a little earlier about roughly where we are with that process. So there's a lot of work going on as to how those frameworks are created, the mechanisms by which we talk with each other, the various commitments the UK government makes to the Scottish government about trade and international relations, and how we deal with those. As to the bill, the next part was about free trade agreements. Clearly, there is going to be a lot of interaction with the Scottish Parliament and Scottish Government, and indeed with officials, as we move forward with developing our ideas about how we negotiate the free trade agreements with the 4 partners we've identified. We are absolutely clear that there should be real, deep and meaningful consultation with the Scottish Government, that we should be open on our side to modifying our proposals based on the information we receive, and I'm absolutely committed to that. It seems to me that we will get much improved and much more deliverable free trade agreements if we can all agree on exactly what they should end up proposing, and indeed how we negotiate them. Quite what that mechanism is going to be exactly and in fine detail is yet to be resolved, but you have my political commitment that I believe it is absolutely right that the devolved authorities should have a very real input into this process. And already there are many meetings. There are specific meetings. I'm having one later on today on free trade agreements with the Government Minister. Contact is happening at every level. I think there's a degree of certainty that needs to be provided to that, which we will provide in due course. But as to the wider issue of frameworks, dispute mechanisms and so on and so forth, that is strictly out with my portfolio, but we do have Rebecca here today who I think can declaim on that a little further.
So, I mean, I think on the frameworks piece, there's been a detailed amount of work going on for many months now at official level, at ministerial level. You have the Joint Ministerial Committee, which is chaired by the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, and that brings together ministers from the different devolved nations to look both at EU exit issues more generally, but also to manage the work on frameworks. And beneath that, there is extensive official level discussions going on, working through all of the different areas where it's been identified that common UK frameworks might be needed, working through the detail of those, really getting into the I suppose the nitty-gritty of the policy areas to look at how these frameworks can be applied, whether we can be looking for non-legislative frameworks, so cooperative approaches like Memorandum of Understanding, and really trying to limit down the number of areas where legislative frameworks might be needed. So there's been detailed series of discussions going on earlier this year, second round of discussions happening now, and there is a lot of activity there, but it is complex work, it is technical work, and it does take time. So it's right that we give that the time that is needed, and ministers are regularly updated, and we'll be reviewing that later in the year.
It's just it's 2 years since the vote, and when we still hear things like in due course, it doesn't provide a lot of certainty. In relation to the question the convener raised, to trying to put some of the technical elements of this into more practical terms. So, for example, the procurement agreement that we're looking at taking forward, could it do things like allow the Scottish Government, for example, to not to have a publicly owned railway, to not put the ferries to the islands out to tender? Would it allow us within public procurement to insist that contractors paid the living wage? Because at the moment, those three areas are often, it's often EU procurement policy that is highlighted as being the barrier to allow these things to happen. So would the new procurement arrangements, in practical terms, allow examples like that to happen?
I think, Convener, that the best I can do is to repeat myself and say our objective here is to transition exactly the same arrangements we have technically changed such that they're operable in UK law. The rules that governed Scottish ministers and indeed UK government ministers previously will be the same in large part, but in UK law as they were previously.
So is that a no?
It will be the same.
Any of your officials come and rescue you in that one?
I can perhaps add something excuse me, about the objective of this government procurement agreement, which is to allow businesses across the UK to actually pitch for contracts in other countries that are signed up to the agreement. So they get the benefit of work, if you like, and contracts and the monetary benefit of that and bringing that back to the UK. And also to allow organisations across the UK to procure public services from a wider range, a sort of wider market, and therefore get better value for the public money that's invested in them. So that's the purpose of this agreement. That's why we want to transition it and still be a member in the UK's own right after exit.
We've procured our rail franchise from a wide EU market that currently is a company that's the Dutch government owns, yet we can't get a public bid here. So effectively we have a railway in public ownership from a foreign country. Would we be able to stop that?
I think we just need to return to the reality here, which is that we're transitioning across the agreement as it currently sits. So anything that is not currently possible will not be possible thereafter. Is it possible that always allowing, absolutely, Suzanne's point is absolutely germane, access to a $1.3 trillion marketplace out there, would we be able to change things under our own right as we are no longer members of the European Union? Yes, but that is an argument for a different day. What we need on Brexit is to be able to have for companies to be absolutely certain what the rules are, that they are the same as they were before, such they can understand them and get on with them. If the UK government, petitioned by the Scottish Parliament and others, decides it is the right time and place for us to change the way that agreement works, well and fine. But this is about certainty and it's about continuity and everyone understanding the ground rules, and whether there may be problems with the EU procurement rules and we may wish to change them, but we need to do that in due course as we can without disrupting everyone's expectations as we leave the European Union. And that's the whole point of the clause. I say it does, I think, have the agreement of the Scottish Parliament. Whether that's happened in a formal way is another matter, but I understand that Scottish officials have indicated to us that they are content for us to take this view and to work in this way.
Okay. Now, just before I move on to Clause 2, does anyone have any questions on Clause 1? No? Okay. Okay, certain Clause 2, Clause 2 of the Bill, Clause 2, subsection 7 of the Bill, is on the implementation of the international trade agreements, and it provides that the power would end or have the sunset clause after 3 years after exit day, unless that period is extended by any regulations. Why has it been considered appropriate that no sunset period should apply to the powers to implement the GPA?
Well, straightforwardly, with the commitment given publicly previously, but by myself again, that what we wish to do with this is simply make sure that we have a mechanism to reflect accessions and indeed resignations, whatever the technical term is for leaving the GPA. It seems perverse, I think, not to have that power available to us simply to make that happen for a continuing period. It is simply an efficient way of doing it. Therefore, I don't believe there is any particular need to sunset it. If we wish to change the GPA, I would suggest to you that there will be other mechanisms by which we would do that, and it would be done with much wider consultation, and I suspect it would use a different mechanism for actually applying those changes. So the powers sit there simply to allow us for a period of time to reflect the reality of membership of the body. That is what they're there to do. In terms of the international trade agreements, it's time limited because we are only to transition agreements that existed on exit day between the European Union and the UK, and therefore it is right that there should be a period in which we can do this, beyond which actually that cut-off point is probably too far away. We started with 5 years in the bill, as I'm sure you know, and we took the representations from members of Parliament and others about how that this was probably too long, agreed that we would modify it to 3 years, and I think that is probably the right balance.
Okay. Sure.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Minister. Just as a specific supplementary, I'm correct in understanding it with regards to clause 2, the sunsetting of 3 years, that can be extended, is that correct? Could you give some examples just for why you believe that power is justified?
I think there were arguments made in similar circumstances in other forums, the EU withdrawal bill and so on and so forth. I think straightforwardly, to have an absolutely hard sunset, if you are right on the cusp of finishing a trade bill, and you would like to get it onto the books, finally you've reached a point where you can transition the existing agreements. It seems to me that it would be foolish to have an absolutely hard cliff edge limit, though of course that does help your negotiation, so there's two sides to this argument. But if it was pretty clear, for example, that an error had been made in scheduling timetables for ratification in a different parliament, you would be able to deal with that, and therefore you could extend it. So that would, in general, it's simply about dealing with circumstance as it arises.
Thank you. And just finally on that matter, the power to extend by another 3 years will be available to UK government ministers, I understand, but not to devolved ministers. What was the reasoning behind that decision?
Simply because this is in the area of reserve competence. It's about free trade deals, it's about international trade, and that is a reserve matter under the Scotland Act. I think that is probably it, though I think it's probably worth noting, I am right, and just officials will confirm, that as and when we extend that power, it's not in the hands of ministers directly. A statutory instrument or a delegated has to be put in front of both houses and passed.
Envisage circumstances where it would be necessary for that power to be extended by another 3 years for specifically devolved matters?
For specifically devolved matters?
Or how for matters which impinge upon devolved competencies?
As I sit here now, I can't think of any particular issue. I mean, it is, I'm sure, possible to sit down and write something out where that would be the case. But I would say to you that this is more about certainty and cliff edge and about dealing with circumstance as it arises than it is about anything substantive about what the UK might want to do with continuity of trade agreements.
And then finally, if such a scenario were to arise where it would be deemed necessary that devolved ministers required an extension, would there be any barriers to that?
Devolved ministers required an extension?
Yes, for example, supposing a UK government ministers were successful in having a SI through the Commons and there was an extension of 3 years, if there were some hypothetical scenario where there was a requirement for that period to be extended as a consequence of that for devolved ministers, would there be any barrier to that sunset provision being extended by a further 3 years for devolved ministers?
I'm not, on the devolved ministers front, this is... Okay, I have to say I'm slightly struggling to get my head around the question, so let's just ask an official if they can do better than I can, which is almost certain, to be honest.
So I think what you're asking is if we needed to, or if a devolved minister needs to use the powers, would we extend in that case? Is that correct? Okay. So, I mean, we would... the answer is, as part of the kind of ongoing process of engaging the devolved administrations in trade agreement continuity, we would foresee that, you would imagine, and we would work closely with the colleagues to understand whether a sunset was appropriate. And you would imagine, as all of us care about continuity in our, in our ongoing trade relationships, that we would be incentivised to be as practical as possible in that situation.
That's very helpful.
I could perhaps add something else about the sunset and why it might be extendable. So, as the Minister has explained, these are about just continuing the existing trade agreements, and the power allows us to implement in domestic UK legislation any changes that we might need to make to reflect the fact that we're taking them on board as a UK only rather than as part of the EU. But there might be changes that we would need to make to keep those agreements operable over time. So they're small changes, but it's still about continuing the effects of those agreements.
I raise a question because hypothetically, if a scenario could arise for UK ministers, it may arise for devolved ministers as well.
I'm sorry I didn't understand. I totally understand the question now.
It's the technical nature of this committee.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Clause 1, 1E and F provide that the UK ministers or all the devolved authorities also have a power to make such provision as is considered appropriate in consequence of any modifications to the list of central government entities in the GPA to be used after the UK has acceded to the agreement. It appears that modifications could be needed due to the machinery of government changes, which is mentioned in paragraph 50 of the Delegated Powers Memorandum. Can you explain further how this power might actually have effect in respect of Scotland? How might the power conceivably be exercised by the Scottish Government to make regulations in consequence of the modifications to the list?
Leave that straight to Alan.
So I'm not an expert on Scotland public entities, but I can give you an example in terms of UK government, which I referenced earlier. So the Department for International Trade and the Department for Exiting the European Union are newly established departments, and at the moment aren't included in our list of entities that are covered. These are the sorts of kind of machinery government changes that we would need to make, and assuming public entities changed in Scotland too, the same logic would apply.
Okay. Right. Okay. So I accept that you're not an expert on Scottish public bodies, but at the same time, there could conceivably come back to the point that Tom was raising a few moments ago. There could certainly be points that it would be beneficial if there was some type of kind of differential position that the Scottish ministers or Scottish agencies actually would see to be better for those particular bodies. So would the UK government actually have any position to be against that type of scenario?
Just to be sure I understand,
Sure.
You're suggesting that we might use certain, where a name is incorrect or where something has to be changed, there might be a desire amongst Scottish ministers to substitute with a body in Scotland, such that that body, we use these powers to insert that name. Am I correct in how I assess the question? I don't know this for a fact, but I suspect that quite a lot of this is probably a matter of negotiation with partners in the agreement about who can and cannot be included and whether or not they are right to be included in that particular circumstance. Beyond that, if officials have more to add, I think that is the complication there, that's I suspect, but there may be...
Yes, and just to add on top of that, obviously, as we mentioned earlier, we're approaching our accession to the GPA from a consistency point of view. So we're looking to have the same coverage and accede as closely as possible in a way that replicates our membership at the moment as part of the EU.
Okay, thank you. Sure. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Alison?
Yes, good morning. I think it's actually good afternoon, Minister. So, on the Clause 2 powers to implement international trade agreements, the UK Government has acknowledged in the Delegated Powers Memorandum that obviously the power is broad enough to allow implementation of substantial amendments, including new obligations. Could you please explain to me what scope is there for existing trade agreements between the EU and third countries to be subject to these changes? In the course of it being adopted in UK third country agreements?
Well, in the end, it's actually very similar to the GPA. We start out with a position that what we're looking to do is create continuity. So in every case where we are negotiating with partners to roll these agreements over, we will be looking for just that, as few changes as possible to provide certainty. Now, over time, it may be that we have room, capacity, and there is desire on both sides to enter into substantially different arrangements. But I suggest to you that all of our focus should be on trying to create that continuity such that nothing in appearance, feel, and look of an agreement changes substantively. That means that there is a very real impetus on and a stimulus for the UK government to try and design these rollovers such that they have very little in the way of change. And so I would not expect that in the vast majority of cases we would find that there is any substantive difference. Now, if it is the case that there is a substantive difference, one of the changes that was made in the bill was that a memorandum, an explanatory document will be placed before the House before ratification that tells the House exactly how an agreement has changed, what, not necessarily all the language absolutely, but what all the purposes are of the changes. Further, we agreed with Jonathan Shinogly of a new Clause 6 and dealing with that whole issue about scrutiny, that the best way of then laying statutory instruments was to have an affirmative procedure, such that Parliament has a genuine time to look at it and has to vote on it, and that the explanatory memorandum for each of those delegated of those instruments would point absolutely back to the report upon the changes in the agreement and say which of those changes this delegated instrument actually affected. So that will give Parliament very real scrutiny and ability to scrutinise and full understanding of what exactly it is they're being asked to agree to. Finally, at the end of all of that, of course, CRAG has been, I always forget the entire, but CRAG A has been amended in 2010 such that the Parliament is now capable, if it can hold itself together, to in one cohesive block, to delay the ratification of any agreement indefinitely. So there are all sorts of checks and balances at every stage, and we believe that that gives Parliament certainty, gives it understanding, and gives it the right to scrutinise at considerable depth, which should allow everyone to understand what changes are being made and whether or not they agree with them.
Okay, so following on for that, if I could just go back to the scope aspect. You know, what scope is there for these regulations to actually be made by the Scottish Government under Clause 2 to make significant changes in, say, our domestic law? You know, if you could think of some examples, you know, of how could these be actually implemented in Scotland?
I can't give you a particular example. Perhaps others can illustrate it a little more colourfully. But where there are requirements to implement something in domestic law, that plainly will be the province of the Scottish Government. This will all be subject to the same the difficulties we've all encountered thus far about Section 12 powers and so on and so forth. But that is how the Scottish Government will be involved in this, that they will implement the required changes to make this work in how they see fit in their own Parliament. But perhaps Eleanor would... Yep. Okay.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were going to add something.
Oh, no, sorry.
No, it's just,
right.
I asked for a bit of colour, but unfortunately, sometimes in these conversations, it's not always possible.
Well, could I go on then and just ask you, why has it been considered appropriate that the trade agreements to which Clause 2 actually applies should be implemented by regulations rather than primary legislation? You know, especially, you know, when there appears that at the point of the proposed implementation, agreements in place before exit day might not have been ratified by the EU, or substantive changes to existing agreements might not have been made.
I think I'm right in saying that if it's not been ratified by the EU, then it's not an agreement we can transition. So I think that probably deals with that point. Sorry, the first part, I've just had a moment. I forget where the first question was.
Right. Let me start again. No,
sorry, I do apologise.
No, you're getting a lot thrown at you. So, you know, why is it being considered appropriate that the trade agreements... Have you got
primary legislation. There are 40 agreements we'd like to transition. There's a little bit of legislation going through Parliament at the moment. I think for pure practical purposes, we need to remember two things. First of all, these are all agreements that have been operable in the EU for at least some time, some actually very recently, but a lot for really quite a long time. They've been fully scrutinised before. They are on the books effectively in UK law. And yes, they may have some changes, but I've outlined the scrutiny that can be involved in that. So these are well understood agreements. They work. Our partners want them. If they didn't, they wouldn't be coming forward. We wouldn't be able to agree them. So there is no great impetus to have fresh primary legislation simply because they're already existing. They're used and they're on the statute book. And capacity would be a very serious issue. So this, we believe, is by far and away the best way to transition these agreements. And I think both parliaments can have confidence that they will understand the agreements when they come forward, because they'll be agreements on the whole they've been using before.
Okay, thank you.
Please, sorry, Suzanne.
Just to add one more thing about what the Minister said about the limitation of the power, and it can only be used to implement agreements that have been signed by the EU by the day of exit.
Okay, I understand. Thank you. Thank you.
Is it a supplementary just on this?
Yeah, just on this. You mentioned it was going to be via affirmative procedure, yeah? Correct. It just, the advice that we've got is that clause 1 would be on a negative procedure. So why is it not affirmative for that?
Because there's no issue of policy to discuss. This is simply about accession to and changing words. The whole purpose of this is to bring into UK law what everybody already uses in UK law and what governs UK law, and therefore it is well known and well understood. And what is being changed is simply about words that need to be changed, lists that need to be changed, and reflect accessions. And so it is something where it can sit on the negative procedure. Any member of Parliament who feels that there's some problem with this, and I'm not quite sure I can understand what the problems would be, but can pray against, and there can be a vote in Parliament under deferred division. But I think we feel that this does not need a great deal of scrutiny. It is simply trying to elucidate or trying to legalise a fact rather than putting policy in place. The policy is adopting the GPA. This is simply a matter of practicality.
We're pretty precious about our scrutiny in this, committee.
That's fine. But if shall we say, I can see how certain accessions might be controversial, so I can see why there might be some interest in that.
Knows how this is all going to unfurl or unravel, then I think that enhanced scrutiny would be more welcome.
Your point is noted, sir.
Okay, Bill.
Convener, hello. Some explanation on some terminology perhaps you can help with. Firstly, on clause 2. Now, it might have been some time ago, but the academic experts who appeared before the Finance and Constitution Committee's discussion of the bill on the 21st of February raised concerns about the clarity and potential width of clause 2, as it applies not only to international trade agreements, which are free trade agreements, but also to an international agreement that mainly relates to trade. That expression I don't think is further defined in clause 8.1. Can you explain why it's considered that this is sufficiently clear, and what in relation to Scotland an agreement that relates mainly to trade would cover?
I think I'm going to leave this to officials. I have a note on it, but you've kind of been through the elements of it.
So, quite simply speaking, an agreement that mainly relates to trade is one that has trade as its content, the majority of its content. So it's a fairly simple explanation, and an example of the type of agreement that this could cover would be an association agreement should the majority of the agreement cover trade-related items.
Would we expect any more guidance as to what percentage trade might take up in that, or,
I think the answer is it's mainly about trade.
That's what it's,
so no, I think is the answer.
Okay. Well, another one, let's see how we get on with this one then. Similarly to clause 1, clause 2 enables the Scottish Government to make regulations as they consider appropriate to implement the relevant trade agreements. I don't know if that's also the mainly relating to trade agreements, but why is that subjective formulation justified rather than the power to make such provision as is necessary, as they consider appropriate versus as is necessary?
Oof.
So I think that's probably a drafting question that we might have to.
We have to put to parliamentary clerks, I suspect. I'm afraid that we're getting down. I have actually asked to go and see the parliamentary clerks to say thank you for the work they did on the trade bill. Perhaps I'll ask them when I go there. In all seriousness, we'll take that, if we may, convener, and give you a technical reply to it by letter, if that's agreeable.
Yeah, that'd be helpful.
Okay.
Thank you.
Tom?
Thank you, convener. Clearly, there are going to be devolved components within statutory instruments. That's been agreed. We all want this to be as smooth and as efficient as possible and to avoid duplication. What information ahead of the publication or with the publication of SIs will the UK Government be able to provide to the Scottish Parliament, given that the detailed provisions in accompanying and explanatory documents that are accompanying instruments with the EU withdrawal bill aren't with the trade bill?
Here again about transitional trade agreement continuity. Ellen's had these detailed discussions with officials, but my impression is that on the whole, the process that I described to you about how we will bring forward the changes and how we will describe those and reference them and place them against the rubric of the text that says how we've changed it versus the technical instruments that we say are required to change this particular aspect of it, should give any observer with access to the parliamentary website more than sufficient access now to that detail. Now, if you wanted a commitment here that officials will point officials at this end to the right documents at the right time, and or find some mechanism for telling Scotland that these issues are arising, and I think we would happily commit to that. But I suspect that Scottish officials are already have those sorts of arrangements in place for themselves. Anything to add?
No, I just agreeing with the Minister that as he mentioned, the document that we're laying before Parliament will be publicly available, and the Scottish Parliament can review it as it wishes. Of course, in advance of that, we're working closely on the Trade Agreement Continuity Programme with Scottish Government officials throughout.
Okay, fine, thank you.
Certainly, paragraph 3 of Schedule 1 of the bill puts requirements on the Scottish Government to consult with UK ministers in certain circumstances before making regulations. Now, this applies where the regulations would make provision about quota arrangements or which are incompatible with quota arrangements. It also applies where the regulations would be commenced before exit day. Can you explain why the provision for consultation is actually considered appropriate and how, in relation to quotas in Scotland, it's envisaged that the consultation requirement will actually operate?
Okay, I think the first thing I'd say is that, of course, this is one of the areas where the amendments were made to the bill to change this substantively. I forget whether it was seek permission before, it was seek consent. So previously it was seek consent and it became to consult. So the UK government has already recognised that this is a sensible area in which to change the language in the bill to allow the Scottish Government to control this issue in and of themselves. I think it is not unreasonable, and frankly not. It is just sensible for the Government of Scotland to want to consult with the UK Government just to make sure that there isn't some implication that they had not thought about. It doesn't imply consent in any way, shape or form, but I think it probably is just good governance to make sure that actually there's something you hadn't missed, or indeed a plan that is coming out of the UK Government which neither side has yet communicated about, which puts in a potential wrinkle or a complication. As to the quotas, no, I'm not placed to be able to tell you how that would work. I suspect in the end it's the Scottish Government making the quotas, so it'll be up to them.
But surely consultation applies both ways?
Depending on the circumstance, yes.
Okay. Certainly, you mentioned in terms of the amendments that were made at the bill. At the report stage in the Commons, the amendments to the bill have aligned the restrictions and limitations on ministers' powers with those in the EU Withdrawal Act, and this includes the restriction on using the powers in clauses 1 and 2 to modify retained direct EU legislation or retained EU law in breach of new sections 30A1 and 57.4 of the Scotland Act as inserted by section 12 of the EU Withdrawal Act. Now, the restriction is in paragraph 2 of Schedule 1 of the Trade Bill. Now, surely this is analogous to clause 11 of the EU Withdrawal Bill, therefore it being a power grab.
I don't believe so. The simple fact is that as the UK leaves the EU, the Scottish Government will have far more powers than it had previously to control issues which were previously controlled by the EU. The UK Government has a responsibility to look after the interests of the whole of the of the UK, of course, and there are certain issues which are under considerable negotiation and which have changed considerably over time, and where both governments are having very constructive negotiations about which of these areas should be reserved for the UK to be able to act in exclusively. Those negotiations to go on. It's not my job to preempt those. The powers in the EU WA bill and the Schedule 12 restrictions, I know are contentious. It is not within my gift to vary those. It's a negotiation that's happening elsewhere with different officials at different times and have been considerably narrowed over time. That much I do know, such that there are now very large areas of competence which the Scottish Government will enjoy absolutely without restriction, and those negotiations continue, and hopefully they will continue further.
But certainly it is important that the negotiations do continue. But notwithstanding that, there is a clear differential of position. and that the Scottish Government clearly feel that the power grab is in operation from the UK Government.
Well, you may call it a power grab. I don't, I'm afraid, agree with that term. It seems to me that it's the right and proper responsibility of the United Kingdom Government to, over a period of time, work out how it will deal effectively with the interests of the United Kingdom as a whole single market. It has to make those assessments. It has to be careful not to create distortions in the UK market. I don't think that's a power grab at all. I think what that is good and responsible government. In due course, no doubt, these negotiations will continue and the gap will narrow. And I wish everyone well in concluding them.
I've got one kind of just final question. I'll bring in a moment, Neil. Just on the issue you mentioned a few moments ago, just on the issue of consultation and dialogue, and this was also mentioned in the earlier session, the two-parting, and I think that's extremely beneficial. I know this isn't to do with the trade bill, but it generally is extremely helpful that there has been more dialogue taking place. But clearly that's on the backdrop of a situation, particularly the GMC process, that has been extremely poor, to say the least. And I know that the Mike Russell, certainly in evidence given to other committees in this Parliament and also in the Chamber, he's clearly indicated his frustration at the level of consultation and lack of consultation. And the EU withdrawal letter is a very good example of that. That the Scottish Government didn't know about it and didn't see it until it was actually published. Can you provide a commitment today that that level of dialogue and consultation will be increased, but also that representations made from Scottish ministers will actually be taken into account and not just brushed aside?
I can only speak for my department, and I can only, in this instance, speak about the negotiation of future trade agreements. I am absolutely determined, as is the Secretary of State, that the consultations we make will be meaningful, they'll be wide, and they'll be deep. And we will take into account the interests of all potential interested parties, and that certainly includes the devolved authorities. We are not yet set on exactly how we will involve the devolved authorities. That is a matter that's being negotiated on the one hand, and I'll be quite honest with you, I'm not entirely at one with the future. I haven't yet absolutely formulated exactly how I want that to happen, and indeed I need to consult with the Secretary of State. But I can make you the commitment that I believe that we will, the more we consult, the more we listen, the more we integrate the needs and desires, assuming that they don't disrupt other potential partners from in devolved authorities. But as long as the more we listen, the more we integrate, and the more we bring the devolved authorities into agreement with us, the stronger our free trade agreements will be, the more we will be united in negotiating them, and the better deal we will do.
Neil?
Since you're here, Minister, I'm sure you're a clean-living man and doesn't go into a bookmaker's shop, but what odds would you give on the Chequers plan getting through Parliament?
The Government has put forward what is a credible plan for exiting the European Union. It fulfills all the obligations and promises that the Prime Minister made and the directives that we were following: free and frictionless borders and end of free movement. I could recite the entire list, but I think you probably read it a couple of times before. It is the only credible offer out there to try and finish to sort this negotiation out. I believe it has a very good chance of succeeding. Pragmatists across Europe will be saying to themselves, this seems like a sensible idea. It solves the Northern Irish issue. It allows free trade to continue. It creates frictionless borders. Can we just get on and create an agreement? So yes, I believe there is a force across Europe that can combine to ensure that this sensible and practical proposal comes to fruition.
So was that 50-1 or 20-1? Or?
I believe it will come to fruition.
Worth a try.
It's certainly, the Minister, I'm conscious that we have went over the time that was allocated, but there are still a few areas of points of clarification that the committee may well seek from yourself, and would you be content to respond to the committee in writing?
Absolutely, of course. If the committee wants to, the clerks wish to list the final questions and we can provide written answers to those, of course, delighted.
That'd be helpful. Certainly, thank you very much, Minister, and also your team for giving evidence to our committee today.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for having us in here.
Okay, thank you. And with that, I'll move into the private session.